All right, welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Courtney Handelin, and I am the Wellness Practitioner and Health Coach for Everside at our Waukesha Employee Health and Wellness Center. And today we are talking about making soup, especially meal prepping soup for lunch in particular, but I guess in general, this is going to be a demo for making a healthier cheeseburger soup. I will link the recipe in the description as well. And before we get into that, I would just like to share a couple things. Again, talking about meal prepping for your lunch and why you might want to do that, why it's a good idea. So I do have some reasons listed up there. I'm not going to read them all, but really the biggest thing, just to kind of summarize that, is when we plan ahead, we tend to have a lot more success with our goals and our wellness. And more ability to follow through on healthier eating, of course. So that I think is number one for me. I know I've experienced that, and I've seen coaching clients experience the same as well. If you plan ahead and you do some meal prep, pack that healthy lunch the night before, it just makes it all the more likely then that you're going to eat a healthy lunch at work. You're going to be more productive and feel better and have a better day. And then, of course, I have other reasons listed there too, like having more energy, actually being able to enjoy your lunch. Great way to use up leftovers or things that need to get used up around your house. And then, of course, too, one thing that we don't think about is sometimes if you leave your house in a rush in the morning and you don't know what you're having for lunch, or didn't have time to pack lunch, then you might find yourself a little bit preoccupied or worried about, what am I going to eat today? So that's one thing, right? It's taking some of your brain power to kind of solve that problem. The other thing is that you might get hungry if you don't have food already at work. And so then that hunger is taking you away from the tasks that you are trying to do or wanting to do. And then, of course, it'll also save you money. So that's always a win for everyone. And then why soup? Again, I said today we are going to make a soup. And soup is just an easy thing. A lot of people do, can go to the store and there's a whole aisle that's full of canned soup. And while that can be an easy staple, like backup option to have on hand, especially if you have those mornings that are crazy, that can be a healthy option to just like keep at your desk if you have that space available. But of course, if you look at them, a lot of them are high in sodium, and they're really processed, and of course extra waste with the packaging. But making your own, you can really personalize it, make it a lot healthier, use up things that you have at home that need to get used up. Soup is a great way to get more vegetables in, and it can be a really good grab and go. I recently started making soup and keeping it or freezing it in like these, drink size style containers, so I could just warm it up and drink it while I'm working or moving on to the next thing. That can be a convenient way to do it as well. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end too, but when you're doing things, like if you are someone who already does make your own soup and you tend to do it for dinner, or big family meals, that's just another idea for like, oh, that could be a quick lunch. If you freeze it in a lunch size portion and label it as such, then, it can be an easy, pull it out of the freezer the night before so it can unthaw, and then you just heat it up the next day. Or again, if you make it and then having it the next day, or putting it in a thermos, warming it up, so then it should still hopefully be warm by lunchtime if you are an on the road type of person. Those thermoses can work great. I think a lot of times we tend to forget about them, but I remember being a child and having that, cool thermos and the soup's still warm from the morning. So anyway, I'll just stop gabbing on about that, and we will talk about, like I said, what we're making today, which is our healthier cheeseburger soup. So up here is the list of ingredients. I do have, like I said, the link is going to be in the description as well for the actual recipe. One thing I will say is with all of this, and anytime you are making soup or really any recipe, don't get hung up on the actual ingredients list of what you need. There are lots of different ways you can make substitutions with spices or with the vegetables that it calls for. Obviously, the more substitutions you make, the further away you might be getting from the what the content is, which maybe go to or maybe not, depending on what your end goal is. So think about if you're looking at an ingredient and thinking like, I don't have that or I don't like that, just take some time to think about how important is this ingredient to the end product, because a lot of times you might find it's not really that important. One thing I will say is this recipe, it does have meat in it. It is very vegetable forward and plant-based forward. You can sub the ground beef. You can sub it for, you could sub lentils, so you can make it vegetarian. You could also make it vegan if you take out the cheese and the milk and make those, choose some dairy alternatives there. So definitely ways to really personalize it. And then with the vegetables, I do like to recommend use what you have on hand, of course. If you have a busy weekend, you're making soup and prepping on the weekend and you're just feeling like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to have time. They a lot of times sell all those vegetables chopped in the produce area. And so sometimes that can just make it all the more likely that you'll actually follow through and do that meal prep if you buy some of it already done. It just saves time and energy, and it's a lot easier when you can just dump things in the pot and let it simmer on the stove for quite a while or in a crock pot. And then the other thing I will say too, before we move on, is allow yourself the freedom to give yourself permission to taste as you go. Taste when you cook the hamburger, after that's cooked and of course cooled a little bit, taste it and make sure like, ooh, is this bringing the flavor that I want? Do I need to add a little bit more salt at some point? So that's one thing that I like to recommend as well, is taste as you go, so that you don't get to the end product and then realize like, wow, this is too salty or this has no flavor. There's, of course, with soup, things you can do at that point still, but it can be helpful to kind of know where the product is going along the way. So making the soup. Of course, anytime you are doing any cooking or meal prep, it is good to first and foremost wash your hands, clean your prep area, soap and water, and then get out all the ingredients you need and review the recipe. It can be really helpful so that you don't suddenly get to a certain spot in the recipe and you're surprised that you don't have something, or we're supposed to do something a different way. Of course, a lot of times those things can be adjusted, but it can just be helpful to kind of wrap your brain around what you are doing. So I did go ahead already and chopped all my stuff up. I also did that next step there of steaming the cauliflower and then putting it into the food processor with some of the chicken broth and some nutritional yeast, because I knew that I would have to pause it. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to hear that. But I will take a second quick to just talk about nutritional yeast. It's listed in the recipe as optional, but I highly encourage it, especially if you're going to make this a more vegetarian or vegan, because it is a really good source of B vitamins and it adds a really nice, like nutty, cheesy flavor. This is what it will look like if you're buying it at the store, and it smells pretty good and it tastes really good on popcorn too. So if you're thinking, how would I ever use that again? See if I can kind of show you there. There we go. Popcorn is one way that you can use it in the future, or again, anytime you're making soups or any type of like cheese sauce. Yeah, great addition to things. So once we have put the cauliflower and the broth and the nutritional yeast and a little bit of salt in the food processor, you're just going to blend it until it's smooth. If you don't have a food processor, I think even just doing a blender would be fine. So here we go. Here's our velvety, and I did taste this and it is really, really good. I was kind of starting to come up with ideas for, ooh, I could do this again and make some other things with that. dips and all sorts of different ideas started coming to mind. So after you do that, then the next step is to cook your ground beef. Oh, let me back up and just say that this cauliflower blended thing, you could do this a day in advance if that's helpful, to kind of break things up with the prep. So that's done. Once you do that, you're gonna cook the ground beef. I also did that in the pot, and I've got it out and ready. And we did lean ground beef, so there wasn't much to drain. But if you wanted to cut down on the fat, again, you could drain that. You know, blot it on, let it sit on paper towel and get that extra fat off. Also, there's the option of doing the lentils, or even half and half lentils and half ground beef. You could do ground turkey, different things like that to switch up the nutrition value of the recipe. While the cauliflower was cooking and while the beef was cooking, I did then also, and I would recommend you do the same, chop up my vegetables. So I've got my carrots, onions, and celery here. Again, this is where this actually, the carrots, onion, and celery, that is called a mirepoix. You might notice if you make soup a lot, it's very common, and almost all soups will call for it. And it's just because it helps to create a really nice, flavorful base for a lot of things. Obviously, it gets a lot of nutrition in there too. But this is the place especially where I recommend, if you feel like you're short on time or you really hate chopping vegetables, or maybe it's just not a skill of yours, just buy it already chopped. Then it'll increase the likelihood that you'll actually use the vegetables. The other thing that I will say is, don't get crazy caught up on the amount. So this was a bag of shredded carrots, and the bag was a lot more than I was going to use. Some we'll use for a salad, but then also I just added extra carrots. And then same with the celery. It only called for 2 stalks of celery. I essentially doubled that and did 4 stalks. The other thing that you can do with celery, if you have extra and you don't like to just eat it plain, is you can cut it into those thin little slices and then put it on a baking sheet. Maybe put a layer of parchment paper or silicone mat down, or wax paper, something like that. Maybe not wax, parchment probably. So spread out the celery and then pop it in the freezer for a half hour, 2 hours, overnight, because maybe you forget it and leave it there for a couple days. And then measure out either 1 cup or 2 cup portions and freeze it in freezer bags. Label it, of course, because then you have it handy for if you want to use that extra celery if you're doing a stir fry or making another soup, making a casserole, anything like that. You're stuffing for Thanksgiving. So then it's easy. You can use it and cook it. I don't know that I would eat it raw, like after it's frozen, but cooking is great. You can do that with onions as well. And if you are one that really, your eyes get watery with the onions, that can be one way to reduce that, is really chilling that onion and making sure it's cold, maybe even just popping it in the freezer for 30 minutes before you start doing that. Okay, and then for this recipe, so I had half a red onion that I had on hand that needed to get used up. I had used half over the weekend, so I cut that up. And then the other part that I did was I took the green onions and I cut up the green part, the green tops, and I'm saving that for serving to spoon on top. And then all the white part, I put in my mix here. And I did put some of the green stuff in here too, because I wanted to make sure I had enough onion. A lot of times it's a 1-to-1 ratio, 2 parts onion, 1 part celery, 1 part carrot. I don't think it matters a whole ton if that's really even. So like I said, don't stress about that. Also chopped up my potatoes while I was doing all that, and the kale. Honestly, I just bought that chopped up. If you don't like kale, that's fine. Don't use it. I think that I actually deviated from the original recipe and added the kale myself. I did see that in some other recipes. And I just think it's great in soup because it adds a nice little crunch, but it doesn't change the flavor a whole lot. It adds a lot of nutrients. Kale is just full of vitamins, really healthy green vegetable. And in my opinion, soup is a really easy way to get that in. And just to save time, I bought that chopped up because it's really easy to chop, but now I don't have to worry. That's one less thing I have to deal with: cutting, washing, chopping, etc. Okay, so let's see, where are we? I kind of rambled on. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is if you are chopping up your carrots, onions, celery, especially, make sure you save the ends, like this little part. One cool thing that you can do with these is, or if you get these kind of wilty green tops of the onion that you're like, I don't really want to mess with that. You can save those, especially the carrots, onion, celery. Put the ends in a freezer bag and then keep them in the freezer, maybe right on the bag, label it as vegetable scraps. Once you've got a gallon-sized bowl, you can use that to make your own vegetable stock, which is awesome, saves a lot of money. And for that, super easy. I think it's just a matter of boiling water and all those, the trimmings of it. Maybe you add some garlic and some dried basil or parsley, thyme, stuff like that. If you want to add some more flavor, a little bit of salt, let that boil for a few hours until it's really fragrant, and then you drain out the vegetable part and just have the liquid, and you could throw that in the freezer. You got yourself some vegetable stock for next time, or freeze it in cubes so that you have can add some flavor when you're making rice or different things like that. All right, enough rambling on. Okay, so now we are at the step of, we cook the meat. Again, something you could also do ahead of time. I think that in this case, it's kind of nice to not do it ahead of time because that's going to add some flavor to your soup. So I'm going to go ahead, again, another place where I'm not going to be measuring. I'm just kind of eyeballing it because cooking is a little bit more free. It's a little bit more forgiving. So I'm just eyeballing about a tablespoon of butter that I'm going to put in there. I will let that melt on the stove. But before I get to that, I'm going to just dump in, let me just make sure, reading again. So melting the butter, then I'm going to just add my carrots, celery, onions, my kale. I'm going to add it right to the pot. I'm also going to add some salt and pepper, and I'm going to saute them until they're softer. I'll put a lid on, that'll speed it up a little bit. Once they're, again, it says very roughly like halfway there. Once they're starting to look soft, or if you forget, not until the end, doesn't really matter. If you don't want to forget, kind of towards the beginning, you're just going to add your spices. Again, the basic here is the basil, the dill, and the parsley. So I've got that measured out and ready to go. I'll probably also add some garlic just because I think that it really improves the flavor of things and also is really healthy for us. And yeah, so I'm going to get that going. And for that, I will pause it because I'm going to have to go over there. But I will try to get a video during it as well. The last thing I wanted to say, because I missed over it with the ground beef, is, again, I added the salt and pepper, but then I also had this milk can. It's a local hamburger company. Hamburger company is not the right word. It's a local restaurant. That's the word. And they have hamburgers, and they made their own like hamburger seasoning. So I added some of that to the ground beef as well, just to give it some extra flavor and bring out that like cheeseburger kind of flavor. All right, so on to the next part. I'm going to warm this up here. And honestly, just on that medium kind of area. So we can get the butter melting. Once the butter is melted, then I'm going to add my celery, onions, carrots, and my kale. To that, let them soften, season it, put the cover on, and then let that cook before I move on to the next. And to be honest, while I am letting those vegetables saute, the next thing that I am going to do, since I do already have my potatoes chopped up and the cauliflower ready, is I am going to shred my cheese. You might notice in the ingredients list, it does say freshly shredded cheese. sharp cheddar is going to be a better choice there. And really, the reason for that is, well, sharp is going to bring more both flavors, so you don't need quite as much. But freshly grated, then it doesn't have that potato flour like coating on the cheese, and so it's going to melt and coagulate just a little bit better, more uniform. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit pause and be right back once the soup is in the next process here, the next stage. Okay, so we're over by my stove now, and I've got my vegetables. They're looking pretty good here. Pretty well cooked. So now I'm just going to go ahead and add the broth. I did add a tiny little bit of broth when I was putting the stuff in there. So feel free to do that. I just didn't feel like the butter, because I had more vegetables, was quite enough to really steam them. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to also bring the heat up. I'm going to add my potatoes here, which are cubed. And I should have said this before, but when you're cutting vegetables, especially things like potatoes, things that don't shrink quite as much, you definitely want to think about bite-size pieces when you're making soup. So I'm just going to give that a stir, and then I'm also going to add the ground beef. Or again, this would be where you would add your lentils if you're doing that instead. So depending on what kind of lentils you're using, you might want to wait until closer to the end. They are kind that will get pretty mushy on you. Okay, so just giving this a stir so that it is all incorporated and I don't have vegetable, kale or carrots stuck at the bottom getting scorched. And again, here's another place I think too where think about how much extra stuff you added, and you might find that maybe you want to add some more broth right away, or water if you don't have enough. I am going to add a little bit more. I think here at this point I would want to see, though some stuff might be higher than the water level, I want to be able to see that liquid level as well. Then just because then it's going to cook and really soak into those vegetables. Again, those potatoes need some cooking, so they need to be in that liquid. You go ahead and cover it up, and then we're just going to let this sit here. It's going to sit here for about 10 to 12 minutes until those potatoes are tender. And depending on how much liquid you have and extra stuff and how much space, it might take a little bit longer. Soup is one of those things that really you can go slow and kind of take all day to cook it, and you don't want to rush that process. So I'll go ahead and pause again because I'm not going to sit here and blabber on to you for 10 minutes, though I'm sure I could. We'll go ahead and pause, and then we'll meet back at the time when it's ready to stir in the blended cauliflower and get that going. Oh, the one thing actually that I forgot to mention, which if you were reading the directions over there on the side, you do want to turn the heat up and bring that broth to a boil, and might want to get that boil before you put the cover on, or if you're waiting, if you do have the cover on, stay close by, because if it boils, that it might come to a boil quicker when the cover comes on, and you might want to then you're going to need to turn it down. So just be aware of that. Turn it up, get it to a boil, and then turn it down. Have the cover on, let it kind of just simmer there and get those potatoes nice and soft for 10 to 12 minutes. Again, this is a place where you can set a timer if you want. You can just kind of look at the time and be like, okay, so it'll be done about this time. Or just let it go and kind of keep checking on it here and there as you're doing other things that you have to do. You'll probably won't overcook it. It'll be okay. And after we're done with this part, then of course too, I'm going to recommend, take a little taste, see where it's at, and we'll add the cauliflower. That'll obviously add some more salt. So hold off on adding salt then, of course, until you've added that and tasted that. And the soup, the cheese that you're going to add is going to add salt too, but it's good to kind of taste as you go. It's looking pretty good now. The vegetables are nice and soft. I scooped a little bit out. This is how I do it to test. I'll just scoop a little bit out with the broth and each of the vegetables, and I look for kind of a bigger, a piece of each vegetable that looks a little bit bigger, and I'll let it cool for a bit, and then I will just taste it to make sure that the vegetables are soft enough. Obviously just like poking it with the spoon too to see if you can slice through it easily is a good way to do it. But I have learned the hard way that sometimes I think it's easy to go through, and then when we actually go to eat it, I realize that the vegetables are not quite done. So I've gotten good at taking some actually out and trying it for that mouthfeel. So once that's ready, you're just going to go ahead and scoop in this cauliflower. Again, this cauliflower, well, one, it brings more nutrients to the soup, but it also gives us, it's a healthier way to get that cream-based effect. When this soup is done, it's really is going to look like it's a creamy-based soup, but without the cream added to it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes it's nice to have a healthier version of that. So just getting all that goodness here. Remember, that was the steamed and then pureed cauliflower with some of the soup stock, and then also a little bit of salt and nutritional yeast. And so add that in. So again, yeah, give that creamy texture and look to it, but also adding a lot of flavor and nutritional value, which is great. Ooh, it smells really good. So that just going to stir it in and then bring it back to a bubble. And then once it's bubbling, which shouldn't take too long, we're going to remove it from the heat and then slowly add in the cheese. Again, I've got my freshly shredded cheese here. You're going to stir that in and try to make sure it's melted before you add some more. So kind of gradually incorporating it into the soup. And then we're going to let the soup sit and stand for 10 minutes to let it thicken. And again, kind of all throughout this, adding additional broth if you need, if you want it to be runnier. If you don't really care about the thickness of the soup, maybe you're running behind and you're like, I just got to feed these kids dinner. You can skip the whole, like, let it thicken for 10 minutes, serve it that way, and next time you eat it, it will have thickened. So I'm going to go ahead and shut this off. It is to a nice bubble now. I'm going to move it over a little bit and begin to add some of this cheese. Again, kind of stirring that in. Just letting it melt, and we'll gradually keep, increasing the cheese splatter. That's why I've got my handy apron on today. Beautiful. So you'll just keep doing that, keep adding the cheese in gradually, let it melt, add some more, and other than the 10 minutes of letting it thicken, if you want, that's about it. That's all it takes. So it's an easy one to, put in a little work and then go do other things, and put in a little more work, go do other things, kind of just keep checking on it, just like any soups. And then, like I said, really the key here is using this prep to your advantage and freezing it in portions that are actually logical for you to use. So, freezing it in those lunch size portions, if that's how it's going to be consumed, or family-sized portions for dinner, and labeling it as such, and kind of keeping an eye on what you've got in your freezer and thinking ahead so that then you can pull it out of the freezer and it's an easy dinner that night, or easy lunch that you can grab out of the fridge on those busy mornings, warm you up on those cold winter days that are coming our way. And yeah, that's it. I am looking forward to trying this soup now with the cheese added and the cauliflower and nutritional yeast for sure. I will just give you a quick little view of it here. Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Oh, right. And on top, then serving it with your favorite burger toppings. So it might be, like I said, the green onions. It might be the using the chopping up some tomatoes, chopping up some pickles, maybe even adding a little squirt of mustard or ketchup on top if you like that. Really, so you can be kind of creative with that. There's some different ideas in the recipe there for you as well. So thanks again for joining me. Don't forget about other opportunities and ways that you can stay engaged. Be sure to check out the other cooking demos we have on here, as well as meditations and exercise videos. Be sure to check out our podcast, Talk About Wellness, cover a lot of different varieties. I like to say it's the podcast with all the toppings. And then, of course, reaching out for coaching if you need some extra support, and check out our Healthier Holidays Challenge this year. Awesome. Hope you have a great day, and happy soup making.